Is everybody excited to hear me talk about standards? Well, if you're not, then I guess you find a different episode. But if you want to hear me talk about the difference between local operating procedures, standard operating procedures, and individual instructor preference, then this is the episode for you. Okay. So I'm going to share what I talk about when I am teaching standards with participants who are often in more advanced training settings. I don't think it's worthy to discuss this with new facilitators, except I'm going to add an asterisk to that, which I'm going to get to in a moment. So the way that I describe this is known as something called the spheres of acceptable practice. This is a visual aid that can help folks understand why we do the things that we do and who tells us to do those things. So I'm going to describe it for people listening. I'm also going to include in the description of this a link to a visual aid with some examples that you can use to help solidify this idea into your heads. So the way that it looks is the visual is a bullseye. There are multiple layers to the bullseye. At the far extreme, outside of the bullseye, is called outside of mainstream practice, or often I sometimes refer that as too risky. The reason this is a risky area is not for physical risk, but more legal risk. You are doing things, if you're outside this area, that is not common in our industry. And if you happen to be the only person doing something, regardless of its safety, when it comes to the physical safety, then you can be at legal risk because you are doing something that is not common. An example in the industry at the moment would be something like a Studebaker wrap or a Swiss seat, which is a tied harness. Now, I could objectively argue that a tied harness is safer than a commercial harness because it has less moving parts, less things that can go wrong as long as you tie the knots correct. Whereas a commercial harness have all the buckles, all the webbing, lots of different touch points that something could go wrong. It's, however, considered risky because it's not very common in the industry anymore. Certainly was common in the 80s and the 90s, even in the early 2000s. But the introduction of commercial harnesses and the reduction in the cost of some of those things meant that it's far more accessible for people to purchase more commercial style harnesses that have leg loops and a waist than they would to tie directly. Sometimes I would also get the argument that it's a good skill to learn the tied harness. I think in certain applications it might be, but it is not something that you're going to interact with very commonly. And so it would be seen as risky to be doing a skill or teaching a skill that is not commonly used in the industry. I use that example because I think sometimes the consideration of outside of the common mainstream practice is something like really, really crazy bad. Like no harness, free climbing or whatever. It's like, yeah, you wouldn't do that. But it can be as simple as things that you may have done when you were younger that just now you can't do because it's not used very commonly. Industry changes, develops, evolves. And I think that that's really important and why I recommend people get regular training. And by regular, I mean at least every 3 years, you're having some form of training again from an outside professional. Could be in-house, but I recommend external. It doesn't have to be with me, but I recommend it because it allows people to get a greater idea of what is suddenly creeped to the outside. Things that we would have assumed were common might now be uncommon. And so it's really important to know what that is so that you don't get yourself into a pickle by doing stuff that is not commonly used anymore. So that's the outside. Once we now get into the actual bullseye, the first circle, the first exterior circle or exterior band is our standard operating procedures, and it comes in layers. The furthest extreme is what is known as AHJs, which is authorities having jurisdiction. And those are often federal or state mandated organizations. Maybe they are like Department of Health and Safety might be a thing, a department or a state department. And then, or it could be a federal, like an OSHA, just for those people who, when you hear me say OSHA, are unsure about the acronym. It's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. I always think it should be the other way, like health and safety instead of safety and health, but that's what it is. The occupational, so it's related to you as an employee. Safety and Health Administration. And the other thing that when I say OSHA, typically people might roll their eyes a little bit because they create rules and you have to abide by those rules. Something I always tell the people who I'm in my trainings is that you as an employee, so if you're listening to this and you're an employee, OSHA is actually to your benefit. Please use OSHA to your benefit instead of seeing it as a negative thing. I think the reason that people see it negative is it's administrators, those who have to check the boxes or pay the fines. Those are people who are upset about it. But the reality for you as an employee is that you should use OSHA to your advantage to protect yourself. There are rules that are placed by OSHA, safety rules that employers should make sure they abide by for the benefit of keeping you safe. This is not rules for the sake of rules. These are rules because someone has got hurt, and the intent is to protect you so you don't get hurt. All right. So utilize OSHA to your advantage. Make sure you're aware that it exists. And if necessary, say that you can't do something because that is an OSHA violation. That is the intent to say, to protect yourself so that you don't get hurt on while you are working. So that might be one. They're an AHJ. Another AHJ might be industry based. It might be like ACA for camping associations, where they will, if you're an ACA accredited camp, you have clear distinction of what you need to do. And so being aware of those is important from a larger scale perspective. What are those larger governing bodies telling us we must do on our courses? Then if you go narrower, get closer, we're still in the standard operating procedure realm, but now we're looking at organizations such as High Five Adventure or other vendors that exist out there, Synago, Project Adventure, Wingspeed, Adventure Works, Challenge Works, Challenge Towers, the Adventure Guild. All of these vendors that exist will create their own form of standards based on what they built. So these are manufacturer guidelines. Sometimes they get referred to as OEMs, original equipment manufacturers. What do they say about what you're using and how should you use it? As an example, if you were to purchase a course that was built by High Five, you will be issued with something called the High Five Guide, which is our standard operating procedures for how those things are operated. And you must abide by what's written in that. You can't stray from that because even though it might be considered within the bucket of standard operating, as we get narrower, we get closer to that center, it gets a little stricter. So we have to abide by what is written there. An example would be something like a giant swing. There are lots of different ways to operate giant swings based on the operator or the manufacturer of those swings. And so you can't take the way that some, let's say, Project Adventure uses theirs. I think it's called the swing shot. You can't use that in the same way that we use our HC swing. Those aren't transferable. So you have to abide by the standard operating procedures. And so it's really important to make sure that you, one, have access to those things. So you're aware of those. Please reach out to your vendor and ask for those if you don't have them, and that you're abiding within those. And you don't get confused by the way you used something at a different site. It may not be transferable. So make sure you're checking with your original equipment manufacturer. And that applies to helmets, harnesses, and those things as well. Making sure you're abiding by what is written in those documents that come with that equipment. If you're ever confused and you don't know, that is a place to reach out to the people that inspect your course or train you. You're a vendor. We're called vendors. And so make sure you reach out to your vendor. You'll know someone who works for an accredited vendor or some form of vendor if you go on to Challenge Course Pros, which is a Facebook group, and you see someone comment, you should reach out to the vendor. You'll know they probably work for one, because it's important for us to make sure we know that we're not putting information out there that people could get confused about. Follow the order of operation of that sphere, all right? Figure out where in that you need to be, which brings me to the next layer, which is your local operating procedures. So the middle circle, we're getting close to that middle, is now a little stricter, and you're abiding by those people above you. So standard operating procedures, AHJs, but the local operating procedure is more specific to your course. So let's say you have a specific knot that you like to tie on a specific element because maybe there have been issues in the past. So if you've got a 2-line where you've got a foot cable and a rope, hand line, sometimes people will choose in your local operating procedures to have that be directly tied the rope directly tied to the participant instead of it being a clip-in knot, because the carabiner on a screw gate or even in an auto lock and carabiner can get opened up and clipped into the hand line. And so you might decide that on your course you're going to directly tie in. You will write that under the element operation specific to that element, and that's a local operating procedure because it's not a standard. Well, it's within the standards, but it's not a standard for everyone to do that. But it might be what you consider a standard for you, which is local. So we're getting smaller. My recommendation to every organization that I train at is that you keep the local operating procedures relatively strict. And that allows every single person to be doing the same thing. An example, let's say we go back to knot tying. Let's say the standards allow you to tie a single figure out in a bite, a figure eight follow through, a double figure out in a bite, a bowline on a bite. You've got lots of options, but maybe you don't want to open all those options up to your organization because you don't want to have everyone tying different knots and it's hard to supervise. So you might say everyone ties the double figure out in a bite. That means if someone who you're hiring only knows how to tie the bowline, they need to learn double figure out in a bite before they can operate on your course. And they can't use the bowline on a bite because you have explicitly said in your local operating procedures that you tie the double figure eight. So that's really important. If you're going to write something down, make sure everyone's doing it. That is local to you. The last circle, the last dot, is something that I refer to as the individual instructor preference, or IIP. And that's where you allow creativity and nuance in your facilitators. And that might be the way that they do an inspection. It might be the commands they say. It might be the framing of the activity. It might be their general patter that they say. But those things are individual. Or it could be that you've listed two knots as an example and the knot saying again, and they choose which one they want to use. So that's their individual instructor preference, a little bit tighter in that circle. The thing that you want to be aware of as an operator or someone who's maybe written these standards or helped craft the standards is that you don't have an individual instructor preference be outside of your local, outside of your standard, and outside into the unknown in terms of those uncommon things that are happening in the industry. So we're keeping our individuals as close to our local or as tight as we can, and then allowing for some nuance if necessary. Now, this is my PSA or my announcement. Itchy nose. This is my announcement to trainers out there or anyone teaching this stuff or teaching on a course. It is really important, and please start doing this, that if you teach an SOP, an LOP, or an IIP, that you are explicit about saying what one those are. I think the big issue around standards that I interact with as someone who's been teaching this for a while and teach to a higher level for those people who have had more experience is that I have a lot of people confusing local operating as standard operating procedures. So they get their LOPs and their SOPs mixed up. And the reason I think that happens is because it's not very clear from the trainer who taught them or the initial person that this is not the standard. So people will think that this is a standard because that's the way they got taught. And it could quite easily have been local, or it could even be instructor preference. And so if you're a trainer, please let your students be aware. So that's this asterisk. So if I go back to the start of why you might share this stuff with new people, if you're teaching brand new people, I want you to make sure you're saying this is standard operating procedure in the industry. This is local operating procedure. Well, this is individual instructor preference, or it's standard to your vendor and the way you operate, so that it creates some clarity around what is the reality of what is a standard, so that when I'm teaching people, there isn't that nuance or that confusion of thinking this is the way I was initially taught, so I thought this was standards. It's okay to teach new people very strict. I often do that when I go to sites. In fact, I do. I'm going to go ahead to some summer camp trainings. I'm only teaching one knot. I don't need to confuse. But I want to be clear with them that knot that I'm going to teach is not the only thing that they could teach in this industry. And so that if they went elsewhere, they're not going to be like, well, that's wrong. And those kind of statements occur. There are some greater levels of nuance. And so this sphere model can help you identify where that nuance is. Okay. Hopefully that's just been helpful. SOPs, LOPs, IIPs, AHJs. I've mentioned a lot of things. Be sure to click into the description of this episode where you'll see a link to the Spheres of Acceptable Practice documentation, which can help you. It gives some examples. It's not based examples in there as well as I've done in this episode. Thank you. If you've got any questions, feel free to email podcast at high5adventure.org. That's podcast at HIGH, the number 5, adventure.org. We can go to Instagram at Vertical Playpen. You can direct message me there. I'm also on LinkedIn, Phil Brown, High 5, HIGH, number 5. You'll find me there. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great summer, and see you on the next one.